Howdy. Welcome back to the House of St. Rainey podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the soul's journey. We're going to talk about what we're up to, and when you understand what we're up to, you can really integrate that awareness into your everyday life. It provides so much purpose, it provides an understanding of your destiny, and so much more. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode. Before we get into it, just want to do a quick shout out to my book, Finding God, Losing God, Becoming God. I am a full-time independent author, encouraging as many people as possible towards unconditional love, the unity consciousness. This book is to help people discover the transformative truth of God, purpose of life beyond religion, by way of observation, contemplation, and intuition. So if you haven't read it, I recommend picking it up, and I hope that it positively serves you. Okay, so the soul's journey. In last week's episode, we discussed who we are as Trinity beings. If you missed it, I would highly recommend listening to it. But in summary, on the highest level, we are all one unified consciousness. On an individual level, we're individual expressions of spirit. That's our higher self. And we're having a lower self human experience, which is the egoic, worldly sense of self. This is the ability to have an authentic free will experience. So that's who we are as individual expressions of consciousness. And the thread that ties all three parts of the multidimensional person, the thread that ties it all together is consciousness. It is unified consciousness, an individual expression of consciousness, and us as humans having a limited experience of consciousness. We are a limited awareness, a limited experience of consciousness. And our soul's journey is an evolution of consciousness. It's an individual evolution of consciousness. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can understand the soul's journey. A lot of people in kind of the spirituality circles might look to the law of one, for example, which talks about 7 densities, which is like your soul's journey. And like right now, the human experience is kind of that 3rd density, and we're evolving. Again, it's an evolution of consciousness, evolving from 3rd density to 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. I think my preferred way to understand the soul's journey, understanding that it's an evolution of individual consciousness, is taking the David Hawkins approach. Again, if you're in the spirituality circles, you've probably heard about the map of consciousness before. But if you haven't heard about this, it is highly illuminating. And if you've never applied the David Hawkins map of consciousness to your own personal, expansive, eternal journey, then this is going to serve you. This is going to help conceptualize what you're up to. Let me briefly introduce David Hawkins. This is a person, Sir David Hawkins, PhD, MD, a very well-renowned author, many, many years dedicated in the study and research of consciousness, clinical work in consciousness, working with clients. He sought to understand the experience of consciousness. And what he did is he created the map of consciousness, which is actually a numeric scale between 0 and 1,000. So the lower levels on this scale, you can consider it between like 0 and 20, is like lower forms of and limited conscious awareness, like animalistic, and even down to like algae and bacteria kind of forms of consciousness that David Hawkins talks about in his books, Transcending the Levels of Consciousness and Power versus Force, etc., whenever he discusses the map of consciousness. But once you get into human awareness, the human level of self-awareness and experiencing the wide range of emotions and levels of consciousness, you get to level 20, and that's categorized as shame. And this map of consciousness, it's a numeric level that goes from, actually, I don't have it memorized, but I have it in my book. Let me just, so starting at level 20, you have shame. This is a universally experienced feeling, level of consciousness. We all feel shame in very unique ways. That's what we're here to do. We're here to experience that. And then you work your way up from there. That's a place of like complete and total despair. And then guilt is 30, apathy is 50, grief is 75, fear is 100, desire is 125, anger is 150, pride is 175, courage is 200. That is a really important threshold in the soul's journey. 200 is the threshold David Hawkins talks about. It's the threshold between truth and falsehood. Once you get to 200 and up, now you can see truth more clearly. We'll talk about that in a second. At level 250, you have neutrality, willingness at 310, acceptance at 350, reason at 400, love is 500, joy is 540, peace is 600, and finally, enlightenment is 700 to 1,000. So this is the map of consciousness. This is the scale of consciousness that David Hawkins talks about. And I see that this is the soul's journey. When you really investigate the difference between, let's say, shame of level 20 all the way up to levels of 500 and 600, when you see the difference between the chasm between the experience of total despair, self-loathing, to the point of like it's actually potentially fatal to be in this low level of consciousness, and then to experience 500 and 600 of pure love without judgment, total inner peace. This is a massive chasm. It's a huge journey to go from 20 to 500, for example. You start to realize that that's a very difficult thing to accomplish in a single incarnation. It's something that we do over the course of many incarnations. Again, we are the individual expression of spirit, having a temporary human experience. We're evolving through these levels of consciousness from basically 20 to 1,000. In my book, I talk about the process of evolving, which is really helpful, but I also highly recommend reading David Hawkins. Transcending the levels of consciousness in particular is incredibly helpful. But when you understand that your soul's journey is an individual evolution of consciousness, then you can pinpoint where you are on the map of consciousness. Then you can, because each of these levels have their own distinct characteristics. Desire is an example that I use in my book. Desire is this level of you are longing for something that you do not presently have. This is a lower level of consciousness. And so you might desire something completely different from everyone else. You might desire a romantic relationship. You might desire a car or a house or whatever you desire. But when you're operating from the egoic level of consciousness that is desire, there is a longing for what you don't have, and you're operating from a place of lack, which produces frustration and discontentment, etc. And then there's specific ways to transcend each level. So you release attachment to the worldly experience. This is for desire. You detach yourself from worldly desire. When you no longer see yourself as the human experience, but as the one having the human experience, you transcend the material realm and the wants for all these external things, because you can let that go. When you realize, first of all, that this is all an illusion anyways, a necessary one that is for your evolution of consciousness, but it's not the totality of reality. So you're able to release that desire. And in the understanding that you are an individual expression of abundance, what could you possibly desire? Desire, like all of the lower levels of consciousness, they eventually become nonsensical. Like judgment becomes nonsensical. That's not necessarily a level of consciousness, but in expanded awareness that we are all one, judgment immediately makes no sense. So anyways, we're all on an individual journey transcending the levels of consciousness. This is what your spiritual journey is. In my book, I talk about it as a spiral staircase. We're here to experience shame. And you're going to experience shame in your own unique individual way. I know within the Christian framework myself, I experienced an extraordinary amount of shame. Actually, it's kind of interesting. I mentioned in one of the earlier podcast episodes that I didn't have sex before marriage because I was like purity, culture, Christian, kid to the maximum. I had no sexual experience before marriage whatsoever because of my commitment to Protestantism. And yet, I dealt with an extraordinary amount of shame. Whether it was looking at pornography and like struggling with that and like having unbearable. I mean, it's hard to articulate the amount of shame towards sex that I had. But upon further reflection, it's just such a strange thing to experience so much shame for something that I'm relatively inexperienced with. Like my sexual experience, this is weird that I'm just talking to the world about my sexual experience, but I don't care. It's a strange thing to have so much shame over something that like I've saved myself for marriage. Anyways, we're all here to experience shame in our own unique ways, and then we transcend that. And you transcend all of these different levels. This is your soul's journey. So when you experience, let's take anger, for example. Anger is something that is, in Christian terminology, it's not like of like a fruit of the spirit, for example. Having like unrighteous anger would be seen as sinful to the Christian. This is not a righteous disposition. It would be a sinful disposition to have that anger. Let's just say that there's like a person who lives angry is not someone who is in spirit. This is not a sin in the sense that it separates you from God. It's just a natural outpouring of the level of consciousness that you're experiencing. Anger, it's an attachment to your ego. No judgment. It's literally just what you're here to experience. This is your evolution of consciousness. So there's no judgment that you experience anger. Those are the feelings that you're meant to experience. This is just, it's just where you are in your soul's journey. You will experience anger until you transcend it, until you decide, I don't want to live as an angry person anymore. And then you transcend it. You feel those angry feelings and you process them and you think, why am I so angry all the time? Why is my ego triggered to be angry all the time? And that's going to be the energy of anger is going to be felt similarly. When I feel angry and when you feel angry, energetically, that's the same kind of feeling. It's not pleasant. I don't prefer feeling angry. I prefer being at peace and living in joy. But you know what it feels like to feel angry. I experience that same kind of feeling. But what triggers your anger versus what might trigger my anger could be completely different. You're here to experience those feelings. And then once you're ready to no longer live like that, then you work towards transcending. By feeling those feelings, you process them. It really helps to have the spiritual perspective of I'm an individual expression of spirit having the human experience. That will help you tremendously. That's also something that you don't really recognize, though. Anger is below the level of 200, which I mentioned is the threshold. Once you reach courage and you go above, you start to see truth a lot more clearly. So I was using anger as an example, but this is the soul's journey. It's to experience all of these levels of consciousness, to feel them, to process them, to feel the pain of them, and to ultimately transcend them. Now, in the lower levels of consciousness, that's sub 200, that's hell. That's just when you're living in that state as baseline consciousness, that is hell. Whether you're an angry person or a prideful person, or you're fueled by desire, you live in shame or fear, that is hell. It's a hellish experience. Once you reach 200 and you start to climb your spiral staircase, Then you start to see truth more clearly. You're literally getting closer to truth. You're literally getting closer to a greater realization of love, joy, and peace, unity consciousness, which is, so I guess I can get into that a little bit too. The level of, I believe it's 500, is love. The pathway to truth on your soul's journey, the direct path, you can take any path that you want to. It doesn't have to be positively polarized through love. It could be negatively polarized. That's a whole nother episode though. If you take a negatively polarized path, then you're just going to be absolutely broken through pain and suffering until catastrophe will bring you to a place of surrender. Or you can intentionally ascend this spiral staircase. If you intentionally take the spiral staircase to evolve through your levels of consciousness, that path is love. That path is unconditional love. When you reach level 500, you are connected to your heart, which means you have loosened up a lot of your mental, rigid demands. And now you're operating from heart space, a greater sense of compassion, empathy, love for everyone, for yourself and for everyone equally. When you work your way from 500 to 600, you are practicing a greater experience of love. Now, loving yourself actually can be a really difficult thing to do for a lot of people. A lot of people struggle with self-loathing. This has to do with attachments to your ego. This has to do with believing a lie that often stems from childhood. It's reprogramming things completely to see yourself as worthy of love. I had this experience where in my own personal journey, I really struggled to love myself. I didn't feel worthy of love. I didn't feel significant. I'm a perfectionist. This all comes from like very early beliefs, seeking external validation when really significance is found within. I had to reprogram that to love myself. I didn't view myself as worthy of love, even though so I strove to be perfect in everything that I did so that I could have love from other people because I didn't feel like I deserved it on my own. In my Christian faith, without Jesus, I'm hopeless. I'm a wretch. I'm a worm. I'm filthy rags to God without Jesus. That's what the Protestant story of Christianity will teach you. You are filthy rags in the sight of God. But if you accept Jesus, God loves you so much, he sent Jesus. So if you accept Jesus, well, now you are seen as righteous as Jesus. But until then, you're filthy. This was my view of self. And so I needed to learn how to love myself by reprogramming all of these beliefs that were deeply ingrained. From 500 to 600, you learn to love yourself and you learn to love others without judgment. Once you get to 600, according to David Hawkins, once you get to 600, you see others as yourself. And my interpretation of this is like the final boss in video game terminology. The final boss of level 500 is you need to make peace with your greatest pain. You need to find love and gratitude and compassion and forgiveness for the person who hurt you the most. How do you do that? You see them as yourself. You understand that we're all individual expressions of consciousness. Once you get to level 600, which is peace, this is unity consciousness, according to David Hawkins. So that's why I understand the direct path to truth is unconditional love through unity consciousness. The soul's journey, the direct path, the intentional path, I call it in my book, intentional ascension, is the path of unconditional love through unity consciousness. You're pursuing unconditional love for everyone with no judgment. And you receive the power. You are compelled and equipped to do that once you see your neighbor as yourself, once you understand, once you see with unity consciousness eyes, you have that vision, non-dualistic perspective. And then beyond 600, and then you're cultivating inner peace. non-judgment. Non-judgment for yourself, non-judgment for all that is. Because you understand that, first of all, this is a temporary illusion. It's a dream that we're having to facilitate, to have structure and order to this evolution of consciousness, to the soul's journey. But it is a dream that we're having, a very, very realistic one. So it's so difficult to break free from because it's very realistic. When you realize unity consciousness and you see the dream that we're operating in, now you're cultivating real inner peace. You're connecting with the true nature of who you are, which is peace. You also understand that everything within this physical dimension is an illusion. The spiritual dimension is ultimate reality. It's ultimate truth. The way that I kind of view it is like you from the spiritual dimension, from the eternal perspective, you could view the universe inside of a cube. From the eternal perspective, there is no time. Time is an illusion that creates structure for us in this human experience. From the spiritual dimension, you'd be able to look at the universe. You could see ancient Egypt happening right now. You could see the year 2050 right now. It's all in this construct of physical matter and time and space that is, from our perspective, a real manifestation of God, but from the eternal perspective, it's an illusion. A very significant one. The purpose of this soul's journey, you might be wondering, is self-realization. Now, I see self-realization as twofold. From spirit perspective, it is the realization, it's a more profound realization of supreme love in the face of fear, when fear can't exist in true reality, but expressing love through fear, it's a profound realization of the supreme depth of love. And so that must happen in a dream. But think about if you have a nightmare. A nightmare is an alternate state of consciousness. You go to sleep at night, you have a horrible nightmare. You wake up the next morning or in the middle of the night with a cold sweat. The nightmare was a dream, but it gave you a very profound sense of relief, a very real feelings of relief that was just a dream. That's what's going on right now. When we experience suffering, it's a nightmare, but it's just a dream. But it produces real feelings. The purpose is for self-realization, the purpose of this entire journey. So for spirit to experience the illusion of fear, to have that profound realization of the extreme depths of love, to experience the illusion of suffering, to experience the realization of a much more profound peace. Imagine experiencing pure perfection at all times with no realization of suffering. Okay, that sounds really nice. Now imagine experiencing suffering and then being rescued from it to experience eternal peace. In my view, that is a much more profound sense of peace. If you experience peace forever and ever with no experience of suffering, that sounds really nice. But if you experience peace after being rescued from hell, that's a more profound sense of peace, at least in my perspective. Self-realization for spirit, we're going on this journey for spirit to realize and explore infinite potentials, which I've mentioned before on this podcast. You're exploring infinite potential. Spirit is exploring infinite potentials through you and through me and through our individual experience of consciousness. Your experience is an experience to be known. It's being known right here and now. To be known, it must be experienced to some degree, even if the experience of it is a dream, which is exactly what it is. Ultimate reality is unified consciousness. You could say it's an infinite living mind that has no walls or boundaries. And to experience the realm of duality, to experience suffering and pain and all of this, it is a nightmare. It's a significant one, but it is simply a nightmare that we will all awaken from. It's ultimate truth. It's our eternal destiny. Self-realization is also for us in the individual sense. So self-realization, the purpose for spirit, explore infinite potentials and realize supreme nature. From our perspective, we are self-realizing, literally realizing who we are. On a journey to realize, I'm not the individual I thought I was. I'm an individual expression of God. It's a pretty radical realization. At least if you're deeply embedded in Christianity and then you realize that you're God, you realize oneness with the Father, that's a very shaking realization to make. It's very intense. I know from experience. But that's what our personal journey is. Our individual journey is a self-realization journey to realize that we are one. 700 to 1,000, this is enlightenment. This is like you are getting closer to ultimate reality, which is pure consciousness. So David Hawkins will say level 1,000 is pure consciousness, which means, so this is eternal destiny stuff. You can see purpose woven throughout this entire individual journey. Now you can pinpoint maybe where you are on the map of consciousness and what you need to work on and how you ascend, how you take your journey to level 1,000. Whether it's through brokenness or it's through intentional ascension, however you do it, that's your valid path. But to reach pure consciousness, this is the ultimate destiny of every soul. This is a complete dissolution of the individual sense of self. Because again, true reality is oneness. So there is no separation whatsoever. If there is physical form, an individual sense of self outside of all that is, then you're still in your evolution of consciousness. Of course, there's no judgment in that. It's just what you're doing. It's just what you're up to. This whole thing, if you struggle with ego, even the word struggle doesn't really make sense. It's just what you're doing. You're attached to your worldly sense of self. It's just what you're here to do. And you're here to eventually transcend that in your own time, in your own way. Eventually, we all reach pure consciousness, which is a complete dissolution of the individual sense of self, which sounds existentially troubling, but really it is the supreme state of being, which is pure love, pure bliss, peace, infinite awareness. So that's the journey. That's the evolution of consciousness. That's the journey of your soul. So it's really helpful to pinpoint where you are on the map of consciousness, so you can recognize what you're here to work on and how to transcend that. If you prefer to intentionally ascend through the path of unconditional love, then it's really helpful to become aware of this. Really briefly, what are the numbers all about? The numbers are David Hawkins used applied kinesiology, so muscle testing, to calibrate an individual's level of consciousness. I've personally experienced muscle testing. It is extraordinarily fascinating and interesting. It's usually used, or it's maybe most commonly used for testing like food allergies or sickness or things like that. But a trained practitioner can test your muscle responses to certain stimuli. And David Hawkins discovered you can do that by asking yes or no questions to determine a person's level of consciousness. And the muscle reaction gives the practitioner a sense of on this numeric calibration. So what's really interesting with this is if someone is calibrated at the level of 20, their life experience will match this level that he explains in his books. He categorizes them in these different energetic experiences. So someone who calibrates at 20 will be observably in despair, self-loathing, high level of shame. That's the person. That person will not have extreme love for self and others without judgment. And likewise, someone who calibrates at 500 will be a person who is at peace, who loves themselves and others, who is very connected to their heart. They don't experience despair to the level of someone who experiences 20, which is really interesting. So now we have an observable approach to the soul's journey. The state that is categorized as 20, shame, that is an observable kind of life experience. And so is 500 at love. And they match, they correlate with that level of calibration. But the numeric calibration, at least in my view, the numbers, it doesn't really matter whether or not you think the calibration system is acceptable or not. It doesn't really matter, I think. What matters is that you read through these different levels and you can observe, like, yeah, this is the human experience. And this is how you transcend through these levels of consciousness. And there is very real power. Anyone that has reached unconditional love through unity consciousness, love for self and others without judgment, experiences power. You can dismiss all this as woo-woo. That's your free decision, and I have no judgment on you for doing that. If you want to experience the power and the miracles of unconditional love and inner peace, then you can take this journey. That is also your free will. It's not up to me to control you. I'm only in control of my own journey. We are all unified consciousness. We're all individual expressions of unified consciousness. We're having these physical experiences of limited conscious awareness for the journey of evolving through the levels of consciousness. That's who we are, and that's what we're up to. I hope that this episode has helped. If you did enjoy this, if you find this podcast helpful, I would greatly appreciate the 5-star review and sharing it. Any sort of promotion helps. Also, if you purchase my book, I am so grateful for the support, and I hope that it positively serves you, just like this podcast. And I will see you in next week's episode.